It all started with a hat, red, bold, and screaming, "Make America Great Again," like a beacon for trouble. Then she appeared. Karen, the embodiment of rage in heels, armed with a phone in one hand and a war in the other. And when the cops rolled up to the park, no one knew her most humiliating moment was just about to begin. Ready for the show? It was one of those ridiculously perfect mornings that makes you think life's finally giving you a break. Clear skies, birds chirping, and just enough of a breeze to keep the coffee from feeling too hot. Michael Winston, a 60-year-old man who looked like he could bench press half his age, was minding his own business. He sat on a park bench with his usual air of calm authority, sipping coffee from a thermos and occasionally nodding to joggers who passed by. On his head was the hat, bright red with bold white letters spelling out, "Make America Great Again." And oh boy, was that hat about to become the center of a storm. Enter Karen, yes, an actual living embodiment of the term. Mid-50s, blonde bob cut sharper than her tongue, and a little white dog that looked like it hadn't been fed in days because it was too busy being spoiled. Karen strutted through the park like she owned the place. When her eyes landed on Michael, her entire body tensed up, like she'd just spotted a cockroach on her $1,200 yoga mat. You could almost hear her thoughts screaming, "Oh no, not another one of those MAGA people ruining my park." Karen stopped in her tracks, staring at Michael like he was a piece of gum stuck to her shoe. She gave her dog's leash a sharp tug, marched over, and wasted no time firing the first shot. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the park like a broken fire alarm. "Do you really think it's appropriate to wear that hat in public? People like you are exactly why this country is falling apart." Michael didn't even flinch. He casually took another sip of his coffee, looked up at her, and raised one eyebrow. Just one. The kind of look that says, "You're not worth my time, lady." This, of course, only fueled Karen's fire. She crossed her arms, her dog yapping at her feet like it had something to add. "Are you going to say something, or is silence your only defense?" Typical. "You can't even explain why you support that clown in the White House." Michael finally spoke, his voice deep and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Ma'am, I'm just sitting here, enjoying my coffee. You're welcome to do the same." That answer wasn't enough for Karen. Oh no, she was on a mission now, and no amount of logic or common decency was going to stop her. "Coffee, is that what you call sitting here flaunting your toxic political beliefs? Do you have any idea how offensive that hat is? People like you have destroyed everything this country used to stand for." Michael leaned back on the bench as if to say, "Go on, get it all out." But Karen took his silence as a challenge. "You think you're some kind of patriot?" she scoffed. "Wearing that hat doesn't make you a patriot. It makes you a walking disaster. Do you even know what you're supporting?" At this point, a few people in the park had started to take notice. A man walking his golden retriever slowed down, and a woman jogging nearby popped out her AirPods. Karen was putting on quite the performance after all. Michael, still calm as ever, looked at her and said, "Ma'am, I don't know what you think you're accomplishing here, but I'm not interested in arguing with you." Wrong move. Karen's face turned a shade of red that almost matched his hat. "Oh, you're not interested? Of course you're not. That's what people like you do. Pretend everything's fine while the rest of us clean up your mess." She pulled out her phone, the ultimate weapon of her kind, and began recording. "Let's see how you like it when the world sees your face plastered all over social media. People like you shouldn't be allowed in public spaces." Michael sighed and shook his head. "Whatever helps you sleep at night, ma'am." But Karen wasn't done. She stopped recording for a moment and dialed 911. Her voice became overly dramatic, like she was auditioning for a soap opera. "Yes, hello, I'm at Central Park, and there's a man here acting suspiciously. He's wearing a MAGA hat, and I feel unsafe. Please send someone right away." The crowd around them grew larger. Whispers spread like wildfire. Did she seriously call the cops over a hat? One guy in a hoodie muttered, "This is why I don't come to this park anymore. Too much drama." Karen hung up triumphant. "Let's see how you explain yourself to the police, Mr. Patriot." Michael didn't react. He simply finished his coffee, screwed the lid back onto the thermos, and leaned forward with his hands clasped together, waiting. Karen, meanwhile, was basking in what she assumed was her moment of victory. But the looks from the onlookers told a different story. They weren't cheering her on. They were watching in disbelief, some even filming the scene themselves. It wasn't long before the sound of sirens broke through the park's peaceful atmosphere. 2 police officers arrived, stepping out of their cruiser and approaching the scene with cautious curiosity. And that's when the real fireworks started. The sound of police sirens echoed through the park, slicing through the morning calm like a knife. Karen straightened her back, chest puffed out with righteous indignation. She clutched her phone like it was Excalibur, ready to wield it as proof of her heroic actions. The cops, 2 officers, one middle-aged with a mustache that screamed, "I've seen it all," and the other younger and fresh-faced, stepped out of their cruiser. Their eyes scanned the scene, landing on Karen first. She wasted no time marching toward them, her dog yipping frantically at her feet. "Officers, thank God you're here," she exclaimed, waving her phone like a victory flag. "That man over there, he's a threat. Look at his hat. He's sitting there acting all smug, but I could feel the aggression coming off of him. He's clearly trying to intimidate people." The younger cop glanced at his partner, who raised an eyebrow but kept quiet. Karen continued, her voice rising for the growing audience. "He's wearing that awful hat. You know the one, the symbol of hate, of division. People like him are why this country is in shambles. And when I confronted him, politely, might I add, he refused to explain himself. Instead, he just sat there, silently judging me, like he's better than the rest of us." By this point, a small crowd had gathered. Phones were out, recording every word Karen spat. Some onlookers were whispering to each other, their faces a mix of disbelief and amusement. The older cop finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "All right, ma'am, let's take a breath here. Can you point out the man you're talking about?" Karen whipped around, pointing dramatically at Michael, who was still sitting on the bench calm as ever. He had shifted his attention to the ducks in the pond nearby, seemingly unbothered by the spectacle unfolding around him. "There, that's him," Karen hissed, her fingers shaking. "Look at that smug face. Look at that hat. He's provoking people." The younger cop blinked, clearly unsure how to handle this situation. His partner, however, walked over to Michael with the weary air of someone who'd been dealing with nonsense like this for decades. "Sir," the older cop said, his tone neutral but professional, "we got a call about you being a disturbance. Mind telling me what's going on here?" Michael slowly stood up, his 6'3" frame towering over everyone around him. His movements were deliberate, controlled, like he had nothing to prove, but everything to back it up. "Well, officer," he began, his voice low and steady, "I'm not sure what this lady told you, but I've been sitting here enjoying my coffee. She's the one who came over, started yelling, and called you for reasons I still don't understand." The older cop nodded, taking in Michael's calm demeanor. "Do you have any ID on you, sir?" Michael reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek leather wallet, and handed over his ID without a word. The cop opened it, and the moment his eyes landed on the badge inside, his entire posture changed. His face shifted from mild suspicion to full-blown respect. "General Winston?" the cop asked, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Michael gave a small nod. "That's correct." The younger cop's eyes widened. "Wait, like U.S. Army General Winston? The guy who—" The older cop cut him off with a quick glance. "Yes, that General Winston." Karen, who had been standing a few feet away with her arms crossed, noticed the change in the officer's demeanor. Her self-righteous smirk faltered. "Excuse me," she interjected, stepping closer. "What's going on here? Why are you looking at him like that? He's the problem." The older cop turned to her, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, do you have any idea who this man is?" Karen scoffed, clearly not grasping the situation. "Does it matter? He's wearing that hat. That's all the proof you need." The younger cop couldn't hold back a smirk, glancing at Michael before addressing Karen. "Ma'am, this man happens to be a decorated U.S. Army general. He's served this country for over 30 years. The words hit Karen like a freight train. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, shock, and finally, a deep red embarrassment. The crowd, sensing the shift, erupted in murmurs. Someone in the back shouted, "Damn, Karen, you really messed up this time." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Well, how was I supposed to know that? He's still wearing that offensive hat. That doesn't excuse—" The older cop held up a hand to silence her. "Ma'am, I suggest you take a moment to think about what you're doing here. You just accused a highly respected member of the military of being a threat because of his choice in headwear. I'm going to need you to step back." "But..." "Step back," the cop repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Karen stumbled backward, clutching her dog's leash as if it were a lifeline. The crowd around her was loving every second of this. One guy in a hoodie muttered, "And they say karma isn't real." Michael, meanwhile, remained calm, his hands casually resting at his sides. The older cop handed him back his ID with a nod. "Apologies for the misunderstanding, sir. We'll take care of this." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, officer." As the cops turned their attention back to Karen, the crowd began to close in a little, phone still recording. Karen was visibly panicking now, her carefully constructed world crumbling under the weight of her own actions. And Michael? He simply sat back down, opened his thermos, and poured himself another cup of coffee. The park had never been quieter, and yet, it had never felt so alive. Karen was standing there, clutching her tiny dog as though it could somehow shield her from the storm she had unleashed. The tension was so thick, you could cut it with a knife, or maybe with the sharp edge of Karen's collapsing self-righteousness. Around her, the murmurs of the crowd had grown louder, shifting from hushed whispers to barely contained laughter. One teenager in the crowd, phone in hand, couldn't resist. "Yo, this is going straight to TikTok. Karen versus General, I'm calling it now." Karen snapped her head around, her face flushed a deep crimson. "Excuse me, this isn't a joke," she shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of embarrassment. "I was just trying to protect the park." The older cop stepped forward, his face a mask of professional restraint. "Ma'am, I think it's safe to say that General Winston wasn't threatening anyone. In fact, from what I can see, the only person causing a disturbance here is you." That was the moment Karen's composure completely unraveled. "But you don't understand," she stammered, gesturing wildly toward Michael. "He's wearing that hat, the disgusting hat. People like him are ruining this country, and someone needs to hold them accountable." From his bench, Michael couldn't help but chuckle, a low, rumbling sound that carried just enough amusement to be heard over the growing chaos. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, and raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "You're doing a great job of holding yourself accountable, ma'am." The crowd erupted into laughter. Someone near the front shouted, "Damn, Karen, you really walked into this one." Karen spun around, her eyes darting from face to face, realizing too late that not a single person was on her side. Even her dog seemed to sense her downfall, letting out a high-pitched whine, as if to say, "Lady, let's just go home." The younger cop, who had been holding back laughter since they arrived, finally lost it. He coughed into his hand to hide his smirk, but failed miserably. "Ma'am," he said, trying to regain his composure, "I think it's time you left the park, for everyone's sake." "But Karen started, her voice growing shriller with each word. "No buts," the older cop cut her off. "You've disrupted the peace, falsely accused a decorated army general, and drawn unnecessary attention to yourself. I suggest you take your dog and leave before this gets worse." The crowd cheered at this. A man in the back yelled, "Walk of shame, Karen, let's see it." Karen's face twisted into an expression of utter humiliation. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly struggling to find any defense that wouldn't make her look worse. Finally, she let out a frustrated huff, yanked on her dog's leash, and stormed off through the park. Her retreat was accompanied by the sound of scattered applause and jeers from the onlookers. As she disappeared down the path, someone muttered, "She's probably Googling how to sue for emotional distress right now." The younger cop turned back to Michael, shaking his head. "I've seen some ridiculous stuff in this job, but this might take the cake." Michael shrugged, his expression one of mild amusement. "People like her remind me why I retired." The older cop extended a hand. "Thank you for your service, sir, and sorry about, well, all of this." Michael shook his hand firmly. "No need to apologize, officer. Just doing your job, though I'd suggest you keep an eye on her. She seems like the type to call again." The crowd began to disperse, though many lingered, still chuckling and sharing their footage of the incident. Michael stood, dusted off his jacket, and adjusted his hat with a smirk. Before leaving, he turned to the younger cop and said, "You know, if she ever figures out who I am, tell her I'd be happy to send her a signed photo. Might calm her down." The younger cop laughed, I'll keep that in mind, sir." As Michael walked away, the park seemed to return to its usual calm. The ducks resumed their lazy paddling, and the joggers picked up their pace. But for the people who had witnessed the spectacle, the story of Karen versus the general would live on, shared at dinner tables, in group chats, and undoubtedly all over social media. And Michael? He didn't need to check the videos to know they'd go viral. After all, nothing travels faster than the downfall of a Karen.